This is Dr. Bufano with another lecture in my series on Middle East politics. This is going to be the third lecture in the series. In today's lecture, we're going to talk a lot about Islam and interfaith relations. What are the historical relations between this faith and other faiths, whether we're talking about polytheists or monotheists such as Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism? We're going to talk about how Islam's interacted with these faiths across time and some of the general trends. So to get into it, I'm going to first share my screen with everybody. So to understand Islam's relationship with other faiths, there are a couple of key concepts we have to learn about. So number one, Islam is a missionary faith. It seeks to spread its faith, much like Christianity. And so we have to first then understand this concept of jihad. Jihad is a core component of Islam. And I do have to emphasize here that there's a lot of misconceptions about the full meaning of jihad. So we're going to talk a lot about that first. Then after that, we're going to talk about this concept, the people of the book. As you're going to find out, Islam has very different relations between polytheists and monotheists. In the early Islamic community, there was a general tolerance for other fellow monotheists. And so we're going to talk about that general tolerance. Although, of course, as you're going to find out, there was also a lot of tension between these communities. In contrast, polytheists got treated very differently from monotheist communities. So we'll understand what this concept of the people of the book is. And then from there, we could then kind of look at each of these different monotheistic communities and their relationships with each other. How did Muslims deal with Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians? In the process, I'll talk about the general history of these different faiths within the region, all of which predate Islam. So first things first, what exactly is jihad? Well, it comes from the Arabic term effort. Specifically, it's this effort or struggle to spread Islam to the rest of the world. In the first class, we talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, right? So the basics of what makes a Muslim a Muslim. Well, Muslims, along with being encouraged to practice their faith in the right way, are also encouraged to spread it through missionary activity. So much like Christians, Muslims are rewarded if they convert somebody in one way or another. So this is a faith that seeks to spread its message of monotheism, the belief that Muhammad is the last prophet of Islam, that the Quran is his revelation from God. Now, Muslims, they can spread the Islamic faith through a variety of different means. While most of you listening to this lecture who are not Muslims might be more familiar with the more radical extreme forms of jihad promoted by terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, the reality is there are a great variety of means to spread Islam, and violence is only one of them, and there's debates within the Islamic community about whether or not the use of violence is moral, and if violence is moral, when should it be used? So how can Muslims spread their faith? Well, number one, part of this is through what's called self-discipline. So Muslims are encouraged to pray 5 times a day, to go to the mosque on Friday, to fast during Ramadan, to go on pilgrimage. Muslims believe by actively doing these things within the community that you set an example for others. You set an example for how to be a good Muslim, and the hope is that if you do it publicly, others outside the community will notice, and this will make them intrigued about the Islamic faith. So going out and practicing your faith in public and doing so in a disciplined manner, this is one way to convert others. Part of it as well is through proselytization. What Muslims know in the Arabic language is dawah. Dawah literally means the call to Islam. So missionary work, just like in Christianity, very common amongst Muslims, going door to door, speaking with people. And, I have some personal experience as someone, I'm not a Muslim myself, but I lived in Egypt for close to 8 years. And I had plenty of people that came up to me and, say, oh, what do you know about Islam? And let me tell you about my faith. I had plenty of, anytime I visited a mosque, sometimes an imam would come up to me and talk to me. And so, that's part of the faith is going out and trying to convert people and talking with non-Muslims about their faith. Now, along with this, scholarship is something else that's prominent. fact, in one of Muhammad's hadith, he encourages Muslims to go out there and obtain religious knowledge and spread it throughout the world, right? So writing about the Quran, studying the Quran, writing about the hadith, that's the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, writing about Islamic law, Sharia law, writing books on theology, defending the existence of God and the validity of the Quran as God's revelation. All of these things are part of scholarship and trying to maybe convince other intellectuals that are not in the Islamic community to follow the faith. So this is more of a kind of high-end elitist way to spread Islam, convincing other academics, to embrace the faith. Another way, though, other than through word of mouth, that Muslims can spread the faith is through money, through charity, right? Giving to the poor, giving aid. Since the beginning of Islam, all sorts of charity networks have been established, through mosques, as well as in the modern era, through things like NGOs and international organizations to deliver food aid, to deliver aid for housing and, other needs of the poor. And by doing this, right, you could entice people. And Christian missionaries have done similar things in various parts of the world as well, right? So using kind of food aid as an in to get people to read your holy book. So charity, this is another way to spread the faith. And then finally, the ones that many non-Muslims are familiar with today, holy war. Certainly, Muhammad wasn't just a religious leader, he was a political leader, and he fought this war with polytheists, right? So he fought the Umayyads in Mecca, the polytheists in Mecca, when he was the political leader of Medina, and he was successful in this jihad, this attempt to spread Islam across Arabia. So Muhammad, in part, right, used warfare as a way to spread Islam. And others following his death also justified the political expansion of Islam, the conquest of new territory, as a means of spreading the faith. Now, in today's world, there's a very intense theological debate about, can you use warfare as a legitimate means to spread Islam? And if so, when? And most Muslims today that do support the use of jihad for these purposes usually argue it should only be in self-defense. But there are radicals out there that believe that this should be used to spread Islam and to not only use violence against non-believers, non-Muslims, but even Muslims that they feel are heretics and that aren't following the true version of Islam. So this is a very controversial term, this form of jihad, which is known as jihad al-sayf, jihad of the sword. And so, as I said, the Islam spread to much of the Middle East in part due to conquest. Muhammad's successors, if you remember from my second lecture, conquered most of the Middle East and North Africa between the years 632 and 750. And over the following centuries, most of the population would eventually convert to Islam. Now, as you're going to find out, though, most of these people weren't forced to convert, at least initially. The swords weren't put to their necks for most of these people. However, there were a variety of other factors that did pressure most of the people of this region to eventually convert. And we're going to talk about some of those factors in a second. Now, when they did conquer the Middle East and North Africa, they encountered a diversity of different religious populations. The most important of these populations were Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. And we're going to talk a bit about them, although there were many others. So they had to figure out, how are we going to deal with these different populations? So this is the region that was conquered so this area in dark red around the Arabian Peninsula, this was the region conquered by Muhammad between 622 and 632 and his Medinan forces. And then his four successors, the Rashidun Caliphate, from 632 to 661 in light red, these are the regions they conquered. And finally, the successor Umayyad Caliphate, which was a monarchy, conquered much of North Africa, parts of Central Asia, what is now much of Pakistan from 661 to 750, as well as Spain here. And so we see this very rapid spread of the Islamic political community. But it would take, as I said, many centuries for the majority of the people living in the region to become Muslims. Now, there were differences in terms of the way that Muslims treated these different populations. And both the Quran and the Hadith set out some rules and regulations in terms of how you could treat these different peoples. Now, first, we're going to look at the polytheists. Now, unlike the monotheists, the polytheists got treated much more harshly by these Muslim conquerors. Now, the term polytheist simply means belief in many gods. And in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia during this time period, there were a lot of these small traditional communities that practice a great variety of different forms of polytheism. So this word polytheism, if you look at the word itself, the word poly means many, theist refers to God. So this is a belief in many gods. And since Islam was a monotheistic faith, they had a lot of antagonism with these polytheists, especially since it was polytheists in Mecca that had oppressed the first Islamic community, right? We talked about how when the Umayyads, they dominated Mecca prior to the coming of Islam, they promoted polytheism. And so naturally, Islam had the most negative attitude towards these groups. And Muslims during this conquest did encounter many polytheists, specifically in parts of Central Asia, in the areas that we now know as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and so on and so forth, as well as in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout this conquest, eventually the Muslim merchants and armies are going to start to cross the Sahara and encounter many peoples from sub-Saharan Africa. And most of these people believed in many gods. They were polytheists. And the Quran sanctions the enslavement of polytheists. If you conquer a territory that has people who believe in many gods, you can and are actually encouraged to enslave them. So the Islamic world, much like the Christian world, the Western world, had slavery. And these slaves, upon being enslaved, were forced to convert to Islam. Some of these slaves were obtained through warfare, some of them were purchased. And when they took in these slaves, they immediately converted them to the Islamic faith. So that was a big justification for slavery. We're going to turn what we see as infidels, heathens, into good Muslims. So there was a lot of anti-polytheistic bigotry here. Similar justifications, by the way, were used for the transatlantic slave trade, right, in the New World and the slaves that were brought over to the Americas. Now, there was some regulations on how to treat these slaves. For one, the Quran encourages good treatment of slaves and eventual manumission. You're not supposed to excessively beat your slaves. You're supposed to feed them, house them, give them, basic access to health care when they need it. So that's part of it, right? You're not supposed to really physically abuse your slaves. You're not supposed to overwork them. It was also highly encouraged as well. Once you converted them to Islam, it was seen as a good thing to what's called manumit them, which means to free individual slaves. Now, it wasn't required in the Quran. In fact, you could keep a slave for life, and you could actually enslave their children as well if you chose to do so. But manumission was encouraged. Now, of course, in practice, these things did not always take place. Some slave owners kept their slaves for life. Some slave owners did beat their slaves. And while slaves did occasionally try to find legal routes to protest or resist this, oftentimes they were powerless to do so. And so there was a lot of abuse of slaves during, during this era in world history, just as there was abuse of slaves in the New World, in the Americas. Now, a couple of other things about slaves as well here. Millions of them were enslaved by Muslims over the course of about a millennium, from the 8th century all the way up until the 19th century. Slavery was prominent throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And they were used for a great variety of purposes. Now, there were some differences here with this slave trade and what took place in the New World, in the Americas. For one, the most common form of slaves in the New World was usually on plantations as farmers, right? But while slaves were used for farming in the Middle East and North Africa, this was not the most common use of slaves. The most common use of slaves was for the use for concubines and for domestic servants. Now, what a concubine is, it's a sex slave. It was seen as a prestigious thing in the early Islamic political community for the elites to have as many slaves as they could afford. Well, a Muslim male could only marry 4 wives. They could have as many sex slaves as they wanted. So they had these large harems where they were able to keep as many slaves as they could afford. So they were used as sex slaves. And there was a lot of domestic servants as well in the cities, in urban areas in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, it is important to keep in mind here as well that if a slave owner did have sex with their concubine and they gave birth to a child, that child was automatically considered the child of the slave owner, and they were freed. Furthermore, the slave owner's mother could not after that be traded to somebody else. And usually it was often the case that after giving birth to the slave master's child, the concubine would be freed. So what does this mean? It means that in the Islamic world, slavery was less likely to get passed to the next generation. So there was a lot more manumission in the freeing of slaves as a consequence of this. Part of also what made slavery different in the Middle East and North Africa, there was less of a clear color barrier. Some of the slaves were white and came from Central Asia, while some of them were black and came from Sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas in the New World, slavery was heavily based on skin color, right? The vast majority of them came from Sub-Saharan Africa. It's another big difference. Now, another difference in the Middle East as well is that sometimes slaves were also used as slave soldiers. And we're going to talk about that more in a future lecture. So lots of different use of slaves in the region. And throughout the course of the conquest, by the way, this was another motivation for conquering the Middle East and North Africa for the Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. There was a great opportunity to gain wealth, resources, slaves. So for these conquerors, they gained a lot financially, as well as spiritually, being able to spread their faith. And so this is a good map just showing you, the different slave trades of the world. Most of you are probably familiar with this transatlantic slave trade that goes from West Africa to the Americas. You can see on my map here. Less people are familiar with the trans-Saharan slave trade that brought millions of people from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa across the Saharan desert. So this lasted a millennium, this slave trade. And unfortunately, in today's world, oftentimes in many Islamic states, this history doesn't get talked about enough. Now, monotheists, okay, so the other group of religious folks. In contrast to polytheists, monotheists, known by the Muslims as the people of the book, were treated very differently. Now, what did the people of the book have in common? Well, number one, they believed in one God, right? This word mono means one, theism meaning God, belief in one God. And all of these different religions as well had religious texts. There were much more sophisticated religions in terms of having, bureaucratic hierarchies. They had religious text, right? So they had a literate priesthood. So these faiths had a lot of similarities to Islam, right? And in fact, as we learned in the first lecture, Islam considers it a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. They believe in most of the same prophets, right? So Muslims believe in the prophethoods of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus. And they also as well have a religious text, just like these other faiths, like the Quran, right? So a lot of similarities between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And during this conquest, Muslims encountered many monotheists. So the part of the regions that they conquered were formerly ruled by the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire. And at that time, Christianity was the majority faith. The other big empire that they conquered was the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire, and the majority faith there was Zoroastrians. And of course, they also encountered small Jewish communities throughout both of those regions. So they conquered many monotheists as a consequence of this. And these people were known as people of the book, and they had to be treated very differently from polytheists. So for one, as long as these monotheists surrendered to Muslim rule, Muslims could not enslave people of the book. Furthermore, these monotheists got to live under Muslim rule, but under certain conditions, certain critical conditions. Number one, of course, as I said, they had to surrender to Muslim authority. They had to respect the right of the caliphs to rule, right? So they had to respect the rule of Islamic authority. Number two, they had to pay a special tax called the jizya. A larger percentage of their income was taxed in comparison with Muslims. So, as you can imagine, this would provide over the centuries this kind of long-term pressure to convert to the Islamic faith, because if you converted, you would get a tax break. So as opposed to using the sword to force Christians and Jews to convert, it was more likely that when conversion takes place, it was often because of economic incentives, because of this higher tax. Now, there's also another reason as well why over the centuries, the number of non-Muslims began to decline across the region. These different peoples of the book could not proselytize. So Christians could not build new churches. Jews couldn't build new synagogues without the permission of Islamic authorities. They could not preach their faith in the public space. They could not convert Muslims to Christianity or Judaism or Zoroastrianism. They had to keep their faiths private, right? So they couldn't go out to the Islamic community and convert. In contrast, Muslims could convert the people of the book. So very different sets of rules. So Muslims cannot convert to other monotheistic faiths. In fact, during this time in world history, and according to the Quran, the penalty for apostasy, that is a Muslim converting to another faith, is death. Now, this is lightened up a bit in the modern world, and some states have different rules about this. We'll talk about that in future lectures, but during this early Islamic age, it was highly discouraged for Muslims to convert to another faith. Furthermore, the peoples of the book, okay, males could not marry Muslim women. Since all these faiths were patriarchal, right? So usually if there was intermarriage, it would be the wife that would convert to the new faith, right? So the Muslims wanted to make sure that this didn't happen. And so thus, Christian males cannot marry Muslim females. However, Muslim males can marry Christian females. So when intermarriage did take place, and oftentimes there was plenty of examples of intermarriage, it usually ended up with a Christian converting to Islam or a Jew converting to Islam. So this is another way the Islamic faith spread. And so Muslims cannot convert to these other faiths. Now, it's important to point out, thus, that this created a system of relative tolerance. But at the same time, these other religious groups were treated as second-class citizens. They had to pay higher taxes. They didn't have the same rights to preach their faith. And this often created tension as well as tolerance. I experienced this during my time in Egypt. For example, at the school where I taught, plenty of Christians and Muslims were friends with each other. They celebrated holidays with each other. In countries where there's significant Christian minorities, there are many Muslims that celebrate Christian holidays like Christmas, for example. So lots of positive relations, but at the same time, sometimes tensions break out. Sometimes acts of violence break out, protests break out, riots break out, and controversies take place. So there is a mix of tolerance and intolerance in this region towards the people of the book, and of course, on the part of Christians and Jews towards Muslims. So now let's go into each of these faiths separately. So now we're going to kind of break it down and look at each of these because their stories are slightly different from one another. And we'll start with the oldest of the monotheistic faiths in the region, Judaism. This is a faith that is over 3,000 years old. So natural starting point here. And so just like Christians and Muslims, there is a belief in one God called Yahweh. And they, much like Christians and Muslims, have a holy book. And this holy book is called the Torah. It's actually the Old Testament of the Bible. And so, of course, just like Christians, they, believe in the creation myth. They, believe in the prophecies of Adam and Noah and Abraham and Moses. So very similar sets of beliefs to Christians and Muslims as a consequence of this. And so, as stated as well, Jews, of course, believe in the same set of prophets, right, as Christians and Muslims do for the most parts. Of course, Jews don't believe in the prophecy of Muhammad, right, and they also don't believe Jesus was the Son of God. So that is a critical difference there. Jews as well also believed that they were God's chosen people. So this religion emerged when polytheism had pretty much dominated the globe at that point in world history. And so they believed that God had blessed them and chosen them. And this also leads to another interesting aspect of the faith. Judaism is not a missionary faith. It doesn't emphasize going out there and converting other people to Judaism. And so they tend to keep their faith behind closed doors within the community. It gets passed down from generation to generation. They don't usually go out and try to convert people like Christianity and Islam. For this reason, there's a relatively small number of Jews out there in the world. Less than 1% of the world consists of Jews. Now, politically, the first Israeli kingdom formed between the 10th and the 6th century in what is today Palestine and Israel. Okay, this ancient kingdom, of course, founded King Solomon, successor King Saul and David, right, very famous kings that founded this ancient kingdom. And at the center of this kingdom was the capital, Jerusalem, which is considered the holiest site for Jews. You see, this land is considered holy for Jews, as well as Christians and Muslims, as you're going to find out. They consider it to be the land that was set aside for God by Jews people after they fled slavery. They fled the land of Egypt, right? And of course, God led them out of slavery into paradise to this holy land where they could preach their monotheistic faith in peace. And at the center of Jerusalem was King Solomon's temple, where sacrifices were made to God. And of course, as the story goes, this kingdom lasted for several centuries, but eventually it got conquered by neighboring empires. First, the northern half of the empire got conquered by this empire called the Assyrians, and then the southern half in 597 BC got conquered by the Babylonians, or at the time ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. You actually find this story in the Bible. And what happened was the Jews of ancient Israel were they were forced into exile. The Babylonians actually forced them to leave this land. And this was very common with ethnic cleansing during this era. These empires often moved peoples around. So they end up having to leave. The temple gets destroyed. So this was a traumatic event in Jewish history, which many felt, this was God punishing them for not being holy enough, for not following the ways of God enough. And it was a lesson to be learned, right? If you don't follow the ways of God, calamity will follow. Now, there's also these stories of redemption, just as God led people out of, Egypt, out of slavery under Moses. During the time of the Persian Empire, the beginnings of the Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, the Jews were allowed to return from exile a few decades after the Babylonian captivity, when the Babylonians had forced them out of Jerusalem. So the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire and allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And in fact, there was a religious edict that was announced at the beginning of the Persian Empire that announced religious toleration for different groups of people. So there was both a history of intolerance and tolerance in the Middle East for different religious groups. So what happens? The Jews return to Jerusalem. They rebuild their temple under Persian rule. They're allowed to continue to practice their faith. Now, the Jews would not remain there forever. What would happen once again is that they would eventually be forced to flee, but this time it was the Romans that forced them to flee. Eventually, Israel was conquered by the Roman Empire. It was made into a province of the Roman Empire called Palestine. And the Romans eventually decided to force the Jews into exile again after a failed Jewish rebellion. During the first century AD, the Jews tried to rebel against Roman rule. It was put down with severity. The temple was destroyed again. Many people were killed. Others were forced into exile. And what happened was, this is known as the Second Exile. Jews fled across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. These merchant communities spread to different parts of the region in exile. And so by the time of the Islamic conquest, There was no one Jewish community throughout the Middle East. There was no political community where you had a Jewish majority. Instead, there were Jewish minorities in these small urban communities, in these towns and cities scattered throughout the region. So, unlike the Christians and Zoroastrians that we're going to talk about, the Jews really were without political power by this time in history. They were a very small minority, less than 1% of the population. And so here's the Jewish diaspora you could see on this map. This is where the Kingdom of Jerusalem was located. Here's Egypt. It's part of the story I was talking about. And Babylon was located here, Persia farther to the east. And here, when Jerusalem was destroyed for the second time, Jews were scattered across the Mediterranean. Like frogs on a pond, these communities began to flee. But because of the fact that this became a community in exile, they became used to traveling. They became used to living in small communities in different cities, and thus they really became used to working in trades like the merchant trades, artisan crafts. And since they were prevented from obtaining political power or owning land, this kind of made them focus on a couple of key professions that they became known for in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. So this is known as the Jewish diaspora. And of course, these Jews, for the most part, they would not return to Jerusalem and to Israel/Palestine until the modern era, really until the 1920s. You wouldn't see a migration back, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture. Anyway, cool little story here. So this is Jerusalem. For Christians, Muslims, and Jews, very holy city. And at the center of Jerusalem, there is still one wall remaining from King Solomon's temple. This is known as the Wailing Wall. Jews make a pilgrimage to this Wailing Wall. And when they come there, they pray. They'll often leave these little notes in the sides of the bricks asking something from God, and they'll weep for their fallen temple, right? So that's why it's known as the Wailing Wall. So it sits here, this wall. Jews will come to the bottom here to pray. Now, the top of the wall, that's a whole nother story. We're going to talk about that in a second. Very different story there with what's going on top here. All right, the second faith here, Christianity. Christianity, a bit younger than Judaism, and it's actually an offshoot of Judaism. It's about 2,000 years old. And of course, there's a central belief here, just like Jews and Muslims, that there is one God. But Christians, for the most part, believe that God has three parts. They believe in the Trinity: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus is the Son. Christians believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And thus, they believe that God visited mankind in the form of man in order to, one, of course, teach lessons to mankind, but also as well to forgive us for our sins. See, Jesus eventually was crucified. Okay, he was just like other religious minorities at that time in Israel and Palestine. They were persecuted by the Roman Empire. Now, just like Jews and Muslims as well, Christians have a holy book, and this holy book is called the Bible, and it consists of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So along with the Jewish books, it also has a set of books that were written by some of Jesus's apostles, as well as St. Paul, who helped spread Christianity throughout much of the Mediterranean region, and he was known for writing these letters and preaching the faith throughout the region. And so we find this in the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus Christ and the stories from his life. And so, of course, just like the Jews, early Christians in the Roman Empire were persecuted, and Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. So much like with Shiism, we talked about how Shiism has this history of martyrdom, right? The different descendants of Muhammad, his cousin Ali, and Fatima were martyred at the hands of Sunni caliphs. Well, much the same way, Jesus was crucified by Roman authorities. And this is seen as a pivotal event in world history for Christians. By doing this, Jesus was forgiving us for our sins. Now, initially, this was a persecuted religion. However, its message struck a chord with much of the poor throughout the Roman Empire, with slaves throughout the Roman Empire. It became a very popular faith, and by the 4th century, it became the faith of the majority. And eventually, the Roman Empire cracked. Now, prior to this, the Roman emperors had actually considered themselves to be gods, and they respected the polytheistic faiths. That's why they try to oppress Judaism and Christianity. But after the time of Constantine, the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. And in fact, it eventually organizes what would become, a organized church, right? And the Roman Empire thus begins to promote Christianity very widely throughout the Mediterranean. Now, eventually, the Roman Empire would divide in half and then collapse. The western part of the Roman Empire was eventually invaded by German barbarians in the from the 5th to the 6th century, and so the western part of the empire would collapse along with the city of Rome, and the capital of the empire eventually moved to the east to a city called Byzantium, later renamed by the Eastern Roman Empire as Constantinople. Okay, it's now located in Turkey today, and later it would be renamed Istanbul. So this became the new heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Now, since the founding of the faith, it is important to mention that Christianity became divided between many different sects over theological issues, over political and economic issues. So there are many different churches throughout the Christian world today, the biggest of which is the Catholic Church, right, which dominated parts of Western Europe, but there are many others, so many others. So, for example, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the East, the Greek Orthodox Church emerged, and that dominated within Constantinople, whereas the Catholic Church was based in Rome. You also had the emergence of the Coptic Church. So the Egyptians developed their own church. The Coptic Church, its liturgy is in the Coptic language. And the Armenians, they developed their own church. The Georgians developed their own church. There's also this church called the Maronite Church, which is based in Lebanon. Then you have the Nestorian Church, the Eastern churches that were founded in various parts of Iran and elsewhere. So lots of different churches out there. Now, how did this region come under Muslim rule? Well, the empire was conquered, right, by most of it, not all of it. Most of the Byzantine Empire was conquered by the Rashidun caliphs between 632 AD and 661 AD. And then some other parts of the empire were also conquered by the Umayyads until 750 AD. So much of the Byzantine Empire was conquered by Muslims. And what was a consequence of this? Well, what happens is Christians fall under Muslim rule. Now, because of things like extra taxation, as well as occasional political persecution, the number of Christians slowly declined across time. Eventually, they became a minority, and today only about 4% of the region now consists of Christians. So over time, there was just a slow decline. Although there are still Christian communities left. If you go to Egypt, for example, today, approximately 10% or to 15% of the community consist of Christians. Now, Jerusalem, just like for Jews, is also important for Christians. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. Here, you're looking at an image of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Along with visiting the Wailing Wall, I also got to visit this church, and it's a relatively short walk from the Wailing Wall, right? So Jerusalem is where Jesus was crucified. So it remains an incredibly important city, and there's these various sites in Jerusalem dedicated to various stages of the cross, the process by which Jesus was crucified, right? There's a whole story behind it. And various different churches across the world also have their own churches and monuments in Jerusalem. So it is a very important holy city. And even after this city was conquered by the Muslims, there would be various attempts by the Christians in future years to get it back. And in fact, for a century, because of the First Crusade, Christians did briefly retake Jerusalem. So during the 11th century. So very important city here for Christians. And here, just a map just to help you put this in perspective. This is what the Byzantine Empire looked like before the Islamic conquest, okay, at its height under Justinian. So consisted of most of the lands of the Mediterranean. This is Byzantium, though, after the Arab conquest. As you could see, it became a shell of its former self, right? It lost its powerful position in the world. And suddenly the Greek Orthodox community found itself in a politically weak position. Now, it is important to keep in mind here that one of the reasons for the success of the Islamic conquest was the fact that the Byzantine Empire had a series of wars with Persia before this conquest that really reduced the treasury of the Byzantine Empire. But there was also another reason as well. Many of the Christian groups that weren't Greek Orthodox disliked being under Byzantine rule. So a lot of Copts, for example, in Egypt were happy with the Islamic conquest because they didn't like being under Greek Orthodox rule. So there's a lot of reasons for the rapid success of the Islamic conquest, and these are some of those reasons. Anyway, in today's world, this is just showing where we find Christian minorities. There are Christian minorities scattered throughout the Middle East, but they are now minorities. As I said, they are partially tolerated, although they still suffer from a lot of discrimination. Now, there have been some changes in the modern world. Some countries have made reforms to make things a little more egalitarian, but we still have a situation where there's a lot of discriminatory laws on the books, as well as a lot of social discrimination towards Christians, which is why Christians tend to migrate at a higher average than Muslims do. So you can see here, countries like Syria and Egypt have some significant minorities. Egypt, as I said, is around 15%. About 10% of Syria consist of Christian minorities. Lebanon is another big one. Over 40% of people in Lebanon are Christians. And there are other minorities scattered throughout this part of the world. All right, the Holy Land, Jerusalem. So we talked about how Jerusalem's important to Christians and Jews. Well, it's also a holy city for Muslims. In fact, it's the third most holy city behind Mecca and Medina. There's a reason for this. Within the Quran, we find this very famous story called the night journey. Muslims believe Muhammad made a journey while asleep from Mecca to Jerusalem to heaven. Now, Jerusalem in the Quran was called Al-Aqsa, the farthest away place, and Muslims today believe that this meant Jerusalem. And they believe that Muhammad made his journey to heaven through Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem had a lot of importance to the early Muslim community. For one, as I said, the Quran pays respect to all of those Judeo-Christian prophets, right? So that's one. Number two, before praying towards Mecca, before Muhammad conquered Mecca in 632, and the Hajj was established, right, the pilgrimage to Mecca, Muslims actually at first prayed towards Jerusalem. That was the first place they prayed towards. So Jerusalem has a lot of holy significance for the Muslim community today. It's the third most holiest city. And as a consequence of this, during the days of the Umayyad Caliphates, on the spot where Muslims believed Muhammad made the night journey, the Umayyad Caliphate built the Dome of the Rock. Okay, this is a spot in Jerusalem where Muslims believe the night journey was made. So they built this structure around this, around this space on top of the Wailing Wall. It literally sits on top of King Solomon's temple. So we got both religions claiming the same site. And as you can imagine, this is going to become historically controversial in later history, including in the modern era. And next to the Dome of the Rock as well, they built a mosque called Al-Aqsa Mosque. So very important site where Muslims, along with making pilgrimages to Mecca and Medina, they also make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And sitting on top of King Solomon's temple makes this a controversial site. So if we go back to that image, I told you that the bottom part of the wall is for Jews, while the top is for Muslims. So Muslims come up here to pray, and a very important site. And it's also a politically intense place. Out of all the historical monuments I've ever visited, it was the most heavily militarized and very tense environment there. There's specific times in which Muslims can be on top. There's specific times for Jews to go on the bottom, and then specific times for tourists to visit. And so it's an incredibly anxious, tense environment when you visit this place as a consequence. All right, last thing to discuss here, and the religion you're probably least familiar with, Zoroastrianism. This was the religion of the Persian Empire before the Islamic conquests. Zoroastrians, they believe in, just like Muslims, Jews, and Christians, in one God, as well as something that's equivalent to a heaven and a hell. They also as well believe that the world is a struggle between good and evil. So they believe in the equivalent of a Satan. And the name of their god is called Ahura Mazda. And their founding prophet was a Persian named Zoroaster, hence the name Zoroastrianism. So they also believe in prophecy, right? And their religion, as I said, its homeland was of the Persian Empire. And in fact, it became the state religion of successive Persian empires. The first Persian empire to be founded, by the way, Persia, its heartland is located in what is now Iran, was founded by Cyrus the Great, and it was called the Achaemenid Empire. And this lasted for several centuries. It was succeeded by the Parthians and then finally by the Sassanids. And successive Persian empires, they promoted this faith, as well as having tolerance for other religious minorities throughout their empire. And the last of these empires, as I stated, was the Sassanid Empire. This is the one that got conquered by the Muslim community. Now, a couple of other things that are important about Zoroastrians. Like other faiths, they have important religious institutions. So for the Jews, it's the synagogue, the temple, right? For Christians, it's the church. For Muslims, it's the mosque. Jews meet at the temple on Saturdays, Christians meet on Sundays, Muslims meet on Fridays. Well, the Zoroastrians have their own temple. They call it the fire temple. And so Zoroastrianism, by the way, it's often known as an ecological religion. They worship fire, air, water, and earth, okay, which they consider to be, a blessed gift from Ahura Mazda, their god, right? And so you're supposed to respect these things. And in fact, fire in particular is respected because it represents light. It represents morality, the good. And wherever a Zoroastrian temple is located, the fire is kept lit. It became a symbol of the Persian empires. Wherever you found a Zoroastrian temple, it was a sign of Persian power. They also have a holy book as well, just like Christians, Jews, and Muslims, called the Avesta. It was written in the Persian language, Farsi. Now, just like the Byzantine Empire, they were conquered, but unlike Byzantium, the whole Persian Empire got conquered. So the Sassanid Empire was conquered completely in 651 AD. And what happens is, just like Christians, slowly over time, Zoroastrians become a minority under Muslim rule. And in fact, there's only about 200,000 Zoroastrians left today. Now, in contrast, there are about 2 billion Christians, right? So there are Christians in other parts of the world other than the Middle East, such as in Europe. And so Christianity survived as a powerful religion, which spread to other parts of the world. But Zoroastrianism, in contrast, there are very few numbers left. A few did escape and go to India, where they're also a minority. As I said, there's only about 200,000 of them left on the planet. Most of them converted to Islam due to a mix of economic incentives, political oppression, as well as, the cultural appeal of Islam to many different peoples. Now, with that said, even though Persia was conquered and most of the people converted to Islam, the Persians did keep many aspects of their culture. They're one of the few places in the Middle East where the Arabic language wasn't fully adopted. So the people in Iran, the majority still speak the Farsi language. They still speak Persian. And they kept a lot of their cultural traditions. So, for example, they continue to celebrate the Zoroastrian New Year. Once a year, it continues to get celebrated. So a lot of traditions that the Persians kept that make them distinct from other parts of the Arabic world. Now, with that said, most people did convert to Islam, and a lot of Arabic words and phrases didn't make their way into Farsi. In fact, a lot of words made their way into the language just because of the importance of the Quran and the Islamic faith. So here we have just a map just showing you where the Sasanian Empire is. Here's was Byzantium and the Rashidun Caliphate here. And just a couple of last words on this. Part of the reason for the great success of the Islamic conquest, ironically, is that Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire were at war with each other constantly. Often part of the reasoning being they wanted to spread their own faith. But because of these disastrous wars, this depleted their treasuries. And when Muhammad united the Arabian Peninsula for the first time in world history, this enabled the conquest of these different places. Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire were not prepared for an invasion from their south. They never expected the Arab community to unite all these different tribes to come together. And by the way, this is the Zoroastrian fire temple, just in case you are curious about what these things look like. So worshiping the elements like fire and water is something that's critical here for this faith. All right, last but not least, just final map I'm going to show you guys. Now, in the first lesson, we learned about the Islamic faith and that the vast majority of people are Islam. But this hides the fact that there is a ton of religious diversity across this region. For one, we learned about the Sunni-Shia divide in the second class, and that there's also many types of Shiism. So this chart here is showing that. So in light green, we have Sunnism here. In dark green, we have Shiism. Furthermore, we have Christian and Jewish minorities here. So because eventually many Jews are going to migrate back to Palestine and eventually form the state of Israel in the 20th century, here there's, of course, the majority of people in Israel are now Jewish. We also have Christian minorities scattered throughout much of the region, and there's even a few Zoroastrians left. There's also other smaller monotheistic communities such as the Yazidi and others. Okay, so anyway, that does it for my lecture. As a kind of just final thought here, we don't oversimplify the relationship between Muslims and these minorities, right? From time to time and place to place, relationships differ greatly, ranging from tolerance to warfare and conflict. And so we don't want to oversimplify any part of this history here. Okay, so that does it. Thanks, guys. If you have any questions, ask in the YouTube video below. Have a great day, and I'll see you at the next lecture. My next lecture is going to talk about the Golden Age of Islam, as well as the difference between Sufism and Salafism.